Imagine a wave of water, muddy and violent, 100 feet deep and 80 miles wide. Imagine this water isn't in the ocean, but in the heartland of America. Imagine it moves not with the speed of a tidal wave, but with the agonizing, relentless crawl of a glacier, swallowing towns, erasing farms, and staying for months. This isn't a dystopian film. This was the spring of 1927. This was the year the Mississippi River, the great artery of the nation, turned on its masters. It was a catastrophe of such biblical scale that it created an inland sea in the middle of the United States, an area the size of the entire state of South Carolina submerged. But the most shocking part of this story isn't the water, it's what the water revealed. The breathtaking hubris of man, the cold-blooded sacrifice of entire communities, and a dark, racist secret that America tried to bury under the silt. This is the story of the day the Mississippi River flooded and put America underwater. Welcome to TSF History. We are your home for the stories that shaped the world but were left in the footnotes. The events that were so shocking, so profound, that they deserve to be told in their entirety. If you believe that history is a warning, not just a lesson, then do us a solid and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You don't want to miss what we're uncovering next. Our story begins not with a storm, but with an idea, an arrogant, dangerous idea. By the 1920s, the United States was riding high on the arrogance of the Jazz Age. We had conquered a continent, we had won a world war, and we believed we had conquered nature itself. For decades, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had been in a slow-motion war with the Mississippi River. The river, naturally, wanted to flood. It's what it does. Its delta is the flood. But that was bad for business. Bad for the massive cotton plantations that lined its banks. So the engineers adopted a fatal policy championed by a man named Captain James Eads. It was called Levees Only. The theory was simple. If you build the levees high enough, the river, constrained and angry, would be forced to dig its own channel deeper, scouring the bottom and thus containing itself. Man would tame the beast. They built the walls higher and higher and higher. They piled earth and sandbags, creating a fragile human cage for a god. They had, in effect, created a massive aqueduct, forcing the river to flow above the surrounding land. By 1926, the engineers declared victory. The Mississippi, they said, was contained. But the river was listening, and in the fall of 1926, it began to rain. It wasn't a single storm. It was a conveyor belt of moisture from the Gulf of Mexico, dumping biblical amounts of rain over the entire central basin of the country. Through the winter and into 1927, it rained and rained and rained. The Ohio River, the Missouri River, the Arkansas River, all the great tributaries poured their swollen fury into the main channel. The Mississippi River, carrying more water than had ever been recorded, began to swell. The Levees Only system, the pride of the engineers, was now a trap. The river was a monster in a cage too small, and it was looking for a way out. The pressure was unimaginable. In April 1927, the volume of water passing through the delta was double what the levees were ever designed to hold. It was carrying more water than all the rivers of the world combined. And on April 21, 1927, near a place called Mounds Landing, Mississippi, the levee broke. It didn't break with a trickle. It broke with a sound like a cannonade. A 1,500-foot section of the levee simply vanished. The river, released from its prison, roared to life. A wall of water, 100 feet high, erupted from the channel. It moved with the force of Niagara Falls, but it wasn't falling into a canyon. It was falling onto the Mississippi Delta, the most fertile cotton land in the world. The flood didn't just rise, It attacked. It scoured buildings from their foundations. It picked up freight trains and tossed them like toys. It moved so fast that people living miles from the river had no time to flee. They heard a distant roar, and moments later, their world was gone. The break at Mound's Landing was just the beginning. The levee system failed in 145 different places. An inland sea, 80 miles wide and 300 miles long, formed over Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana. An area of 27,000 square miles was underwater. That is the combined size of Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Vermont. In Arkansas, 14% of the entire state was submerged. The water was so deep that in Greenville, Mississippi, it lapped at the third story of downtown buildings. For the million people who lived in this delta, the world had ended. Refugees, hundreds of thousands of them, clung to anything that floated. They climbed into trees, onto the roofs of their submerged homes, and onto the only high ground left, the very levees that had betrayed them. They were trapped, surrounded by a swirling brown ocean full of their dead livestock, their homes, and the bodies of their neighbors. The blues musician Memphis Minnie, who lived through the horror, would later write the song When the Levee Breaks. The lyrics weren't metaphor, they were journalism. I was driftin' and driftin', I was all in the flood. I was driftin' and driftin', I was all in the flood. I ain't got nobody to tell my troubles to. As this apocalyptic wave of water moved south, it had one final destination, the jewel of the Delta, the city of New Orleans. The city was protected by its own levees, but the pressure was too much. The river was 20 feet above street level. The city was in a panic. The city's elite, the bankers, the cotton brokers, the old money families, knew that if the levee broke at New Orleans, the entire city would be destroyed, its economy erased. So they hatched a cold-blooded plan. To save the city, they would have to sacrifice the country. They decided they would intentionally dynamite a levee south of the city at a place called Carnarvon. This would act as a pressure release valve, sending the water on a controlled path to the Gulf, flooding the less populated parishes of St. Bernard and Plaquemines.
There was just one problem. Less populated doesn't mean unpopulated. These parishes were home to thousands of poor, white and black, trappers, fishermen, and farmers. They were the Cajuns and Isleños. The city fathers, led by Governor O.H. Simpson, went to these people and made a promise. They swore, on paper, that if the people agreed to be flooded, to have their homes and livelihoods completely destroyed, the city of New Orleans would compensate them for every penny. It was a lie. The people of St. Bernard and Plaquemines had no choice. On April 29, 1927, officials loaded 39 tons of dynamite onto the Carnarvon levee. As news cameras rolled, they blew a hole in the earth. The river, grateful for the new path, surged through, wiping St. Bernard and Plaquemines parishes off the map. It saved New Orleans. But the compensation? It never came. The powerful bankers of New Orleans defaulted on their promise, leaving the people they sacrificed with nothing. It was a staggering act of class warfare, a declaration that the rich and powerful were worth saving and the poor were not. But even this betrayal pales in comparison to the horror that was unfolding upriver. The flood had displaced 700,000 people, and in the deeply segregated feudal society of the 1920s Delta, this presented a crisis for the white plantation owners. Their plantations were gone, but their biggest fear was that their labor force, the 330,000 African-American sharecroppers, would leave. If they got on rescue boats and went north, the plantation economy would collapse forever. So, they decided to make sure their property stayed put. President Calvin Coolidge put his Secretary of Commerce, a man named Herbert Hoover, in charge of the relief effort. Hoover, a brilliant administrator, arrived and set up a system of 154 refugee camps. On the surface, it was a triumph of American logistics. They used radio, airplanes, and a massive fleet of boats to rescue people and bring them to safety. Hoover became a national hero, the great humanitarian. But what the newsreels didn't show was the truth of those camps. For the white refugees, the camps were a sanctuary. For the black refugees, they were prisons. In Greenville, Mississippi, thousands of black families were herded onto the top of the one remaining levee. They were surrounded by the National Guard, who had one order: do not let the Negroes escape. When rescue boats arrived, they would often take white families to safety in cities, but would refuse to take black families, leaving them on the levee to starve. Why? Because the local planters had ordered it. The planters, led by a man named Leroy Percy, took control of the Greenville camp. They saw the relief effort not as a rescue, but as a way to maintain their workforce. They controlled the food, the medicine, and the movement of every black person. The conditions were horrific. Rations sent by the Red Cross were stolen by the guardsmen and sold on the black market. Black women were unable to protect themselves from assault by the guardsmen. But the most sinister part was the labor. Black men were rounded up from the camps at gunpoint. They were forced onto barges and taken to work on other levees, often without food, standing in snake-infested water for days on end. They were not volunteers. They were a slave army, forced to try and repair the system that had destroyed their lives. This wasn't a rescue. It was the reimposition of slavery, pure and simple, under the guise of emergency relief. They even issued Red Cross cards that identified each black man by the plantation he belonged to. You could not get food for your family unless your card was stamped by your plantation owner, proving you were his laborer. Hoover knew. He had to know. The Associated Press began to report on the abuses. The NAACP and the black press were screaming about the concentration camps in Mississippi. Fearing a political scandal that would ruin his presidential ambitions, Hoover made a cynical deal. He created a colored advisory commission headed by Robert Moton of the Tuskegee Institute to investigate. Moton and his team gathered hundreds of pages of sworn affidavits detailing the rapes, beatings, and forced labor. They handed this damning report directly to Herbert Hoover, and Hoover buried it. He buried the report, suppressed the stories, and praised the cooperation of the local white leaders. His PR campaign was a success. The great humanitarian looked like a hero, and in 1928, he was overwhelmingly elected President of the United States, riding a wave of goodwill from a flood that he had covered up. The water finally receded in the summer of 1927. It left behind a wasteland of mud, disease, and ruin. The social impact was even greater. The Levees Only policy was dead. The 1928 Flood Control Act was passed, the first time the federal government ever took full responsibility for flood control. It authorized the creation of spillways, like the Bonnet Care, which protects New Orleans to this day, and reservoirs. It was an admission that the river could not be conquered, only managed. But the biggest legacy was human. The black population of the Delta, having seen the absolute betrayal of the system they lived under, did the only thing they could. They left. The Great Flood of 1927 was the single greatest catalyst for the Great Migration. Hundreds of thousands of sharecroppers, having been imprisoned, starved, and forced back into slavery, abandoned the South. They got on trains and headed for Chicago, for Detroit, for the North. They were voting with their feet. The flood had broken the plantation system more effectively than any war. The Great Mississippi Flood was more than a natural disaster. It was a man-made one. It was caused by the hubris of engineers who thought they could chain a god. It was worsened by the greed of politicians who sacrificed the poor to save the rich. And it revealed a social disease of racism so profound that it saw 700,000 citizens not as people to be rescued, but as property to be contained. The water eventually dried, but the stains of 1927, the betrayal, the cruelty,
the forced migration, redrew the map of America forever. What part of this story shocks you the most? Is it the sheer power of the water? The arrogant Levees Only policy? The cold-blooded decision to dynamite the levee at Caernarvon? Or the horrific, state-sanctioned imprisonment of black refugees? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. This is a part of American history that is rarely taught, but desperately needs to be remembered. If you found this story important, please hit that like button, subscribe to TSF History, and ring the bell to join us on our next journey into the past. Thank you for watching.